The Mitchell mansion stood like a palace that afternoon, its chandeliers glittering with the reflection of sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows. Outside, luxury cars lined the driveway like trophies on display, and inside, the entire hall was dressed for a celebration that should have been unforgettable. Pink balloons floated gently above the polished hardwood floors, their ribbons brushing against rows of perfectly arranged chairs. A towering cake shaped like a princess castle dominated the center table, its sugar turrets painted in gold and silver detail. Cupcakes, each topped with edible pearls, rested untouched on crystal platters. A clown, hired for more than most families, spent on rent in a month, leaned against the wall scrolling through his phone in boredom, his painted smile wilting as the minutes dragged on. The grand clock in the foyer ticked louder than usual, as if mocking the silence. It had been 2 hours since the party was supposed to begin, yet not a single child had walked through the heavy oak doors. Robert Mitchell, dressed in his immaculate gray suit and Italian silk tie, kept glancing at his Rolex. With each passing minute, he felt his chest tighten, the weight of dread pressing against his ribs. His daughter Emma sat in her custom wheelchair, her small hands folded neatly on her lap, eyes bright with the fragile hope that any moment now, someone would arrive. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the cavernous hall. "When are my friends going to get here?" Robert's throat clenched. He forced a smile, bending slightly so his eyes met hers. "They must be stuck in traffic, sweetheart. You know how Saturdays can be." The words left his lips with painful ease, the kind of lie parents tell to protect their children's hearts. Yet even as he said it, Robert knew the truth. He had seen it creeping in over the past 2 years since the accident. The polite excuses, the declined invitations, the sudden busyness of families who once begged for playdates. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, adjusting her pink satin dress. She looked like a princess waiting in a castle for her guests. But the castle was silent, and the guests had abandoned their queen. Her eyes flickered to the cake, its perfect towers glimmering in the light. But the sight no longer brought joy. She looked back at the door with a longing that twisted Robert's heart. The clown sighed audibly and tapped his foot against the marble. Even the staff hired for the occasion were beginning to show impatience. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken truth. Something about the silence of the hall screamed louder than any laughter ever could. Robert turned toward the window, pulling his tie loose as though it were choking him. Outside, the manicured gardens of Westfield stretched endlessly, a portrait of privilege. Yet for all the wealth and beauty surrounding him, his daughter sat alone, uncelebrated, abandoned by the very people who claimed to share their refined values. He clenched his jaw, his mind replaying the day of the accident. Margaret's scream, the screech of tires, the way Emma's small hand had gone limp before she was rushed to the hospital. He had built empires, commanded boardrooms, but in that moment he had been powerless. And now, 2 years later, the world continued to punish her. He walked back to Emma, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. "Princess," he whispered, "sometimes people forget what really matters, but you are worth more than all the guests in the world." Emma's lips curled into the faintest smile, though her eyes betrayed the doubt she carried. Robert knew she was too smart to fully believe his excuses. She was only 7, yet the accident had aged her in ways he wished it hadn't. She could see the truth. Her wheelchair frightened people. Her condition made the town's elite uncomfortable, as though disability was contagious, something that could taint their perfect circles. The sound of silence was broken only by the ticking clock. Robert looked at the untouched cake again, his reflection warped in its glossy sugar surface. He realized then that this party wasn't just about Emma. It was a test, a silent measure of who truly cared. And as the emptiness pressed in from every corner of that grand hall, one thought rose sharply in his mind. If no one came, what would that say about the world he had built his life in? And then, as if on cue, the sharp sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. It cut through the silence like a blade, startling both father and daughter. Robert straightened instantly, his heart pounding in his chest. For a brief, desperate moment he believed, hoped, that maybe the children had finally arrived, that maybe the night could still be saved. But deep down in a corner of his heart, he didn't want to admit. He knew this wasn't going to be ordinary. Something was about to happen. Something that would not only change Emma's birthday, but rewrite everything he thought he knew about justice, kindness, and the true meaning of family. The doorbells. Echo faded into silence, and Robert stood frozen for a moment before hurrying to the door. He smoothed down his tie, forcing the kind of polished smile that came naturally in boardrooms but felt brittle in this moment. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the heavy oak door, but there was no crowd of children in bright dresses and polished shoes. No line of gift bags or well-dressed parents offering excuses for being late. Standing on the marble steps was only his daughter, Emma, peeking curiously from her wheelchair down the hall. She had maneuvered herself closer to see who had come, her wide eyes brimming with fragile hope. Yet when Robert pulled the door open, it wasn't a friend from school or one of Westfield's wealthy families. It was a delivery man with a bouquet of roses, sent not by a guest but by his secretary, who had remembered the date from Robert's calendar. "Happy birthday to your little girl," the man said politely before leaving. Robert thanked him, quietly, closing the door with a heaviness in his chest. He returned to Emma, who stared at the roses with a puzzled frown. "Who were they from?" she asked. "Someone from work," Robert replied, trying to sound cheerful. But Emma's small face dropped. She knew what it meant. None of her friends had come. Not one. Her voice was soft when she spoke again, the kind of softness that carried more weight than a shout. "Daddy, did they forget about me?" The words pierced him like a blade. Robert crouched down in front of her, holding her hands. "No, sweetheart, they didn't forget. Sometimes people—" His voice faltered. How could he explain cruelty wrapped in politeness? How could he tell his little girl that children hadn't come because their parents were too uncomfortable, with her wheelchair, too fragile to face reality? He swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people don't understand how special you are, but that doesn't mean you aren't loved." Emma's lips quivered as she tried to smile. She didn't cry, not this time, but the sadness in her eyes was worse than tears. Robert felt his stomach twist with guilt. He thought of the accident again, the night that shattered their world. Margaret's laughter still haunted him, the way she used to dance with Emma in the kitchen, her hair loose, her sari flowing as music played on a scratchy speaker. That was before the crash, before screeching tires and shattering glass took Margaret's life and stole Emma's ability to walk. Since that night, Emma had never been the same. The doctors saved her, yes, but the girl who once ran through the garden with flowers in her hair was now confined to a chair, and as if fate's cruelty wasn't enough, the children she once called friends slowly drifted away. Parents stopped calling. Birthday invitations stopped coming. And now, on the very day meant to celebrate her, the silence of those empty chairs screamed the truth. The world didn't know how to see her anymore. Robert tried to distract her, clapping his hands. "Why don't we cut the cake, Princess? Just you and me. We don't need anyone else." But Emma shook her head. Her eyes locked on the door, stubborn and waiting. "No, Daddy. Someone will come. I know it." Her voice carried both innocence and an aching hope that made Robert's heartache. He wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the idea that perhaps someone, anyone, would walk through those doors. But deep down, he felt the crushing truth. The families of Westfield had made their decision. The clock ticked louder, each sound like a hammer against Robert's chest. He leaned against the wall, loosening his tie again, staring at the untouched cake and rows of empty chairs. The grandeur of the hall felt mocking now, a cold stage without an audience. He looked back at his daughter, who sat with her chin raised, eyes still on the door, believing against all reason that a friend would appear. And in that moment, Robert wished for a miracle. Not the kind money could buy, not the kind power could demand, but the kind that came from grace itself. And then, Just as if her stubborn faith had summoned it, the doorbell rang again. Robert's head snapped up. Emma's eyes lit up instantly, her small hands gripping the wheels of her chair. "Daddy, they came," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Robert's heart pounded as he strode to the door, every step laced with suspense. He reached for the handle and with a deep breath pulled it open. But what he found standing on the other side was not what he or Emma expected. Robert's polished smile faltered the moment the door swung open. Standing on the marble steps was not a polished child from one of Westfield's elite families, dressed in designer clothes and clutching an expensive gift bag. Instead, it was Zoe, a boy, about 8 years old, wearing a Superman t-shirt with 2 small holes near the hem and a pair of jeans patched at the knees. His sneakers were worn to the point that the laces had frayed, but his smile glowed brighter than any chandelier in the mansion. "Hi, sir," the boy said politely, shifting from one foot to the other as if nervous but determined. "I heard there was a birthday party here. My name's Jamal. I live down the street in the housing apartments." He pointed behind him toward the tall, cracked buildings visible through the wrought iron gates. His eyes sparkled with a joy that seemed untouched by the weight of his surroundings. Robert blinked, stunned into silence. For hours he had been waiting, hoping that Emma's classmates would appear, that their parents would walk in with fake smiles and shallow excuses. Yet here was a boy with no invitation, no gift, and nothing to offer except his presence. Jamal glanced inside, noticing the rows of empty chairs and untouched cake. His voice softened. "I don't have an invitation, but I thought maybe the birthday girl is feeling lonely. I promise I'll be on my best behavior." Before Robert could find words, a soft sound came from behind him, the familiar squeak of Emma's wheelchair wheels against the floor. She had rolled herself forward, her curiosity brighter than her father's hesitation. "Daddy, who is it?" Robert stepped aside, and Jamal's eyes widened when he saw her. Without a trace of discomfort, without the awkward silence Robert had grown used to when children saw Emma's chair, Jamal's face lit up. He bent down slightly, waving. "Hi, you must be the birthday girl. Happy birthday." His voice carried a simple sincerity that no amount of wealth could buy. "Sorry I don't have a present, but I can sing happy birthday really, really loud if you want." For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in months, Emma giggled, a genuine, bubbling laugh that rang out in the empty hall like a bell. It startled Robert so much that he felt tears sting the back of his eyes. Therapists had tried for years to bring back that sound. Doctors had told him to be patient. Money had been poured into every form of treatment, every distraction, and yet, here was this boy, this stranger, who had managed in seconds to bring life back to his daughter's face. Emma wheeled closer, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Do you really want to stay at my party?" she asked. "Of course, I do," Jamal replied instantly, his missing front tooth flashing in his wide grin. "Birthday parties are the best, and it looks like you need a friend." Robert's chest tightened as he watched them. In 5 minutes, this boy had done what? His millions could not. He had made Emma forget her loneliness. And yet there was something else about Jamal that unsettled Robert in a strange way. Something in his eyes, something far too mature for an 8-year-old. It was the look of a child who had known rejection, who had felt the sting of being left out and had chosen, instead of bitterness, to reach out to someone else. Emma clapped her hands together. "Daddy, can he stay?" Robert hesitated only for a heartbeat before nodding. His voice was softer than usual, almost reverent. "Come in, Jamal. Emma really needs a true friend today." As Jamal stepped inside the grand hall, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, Robert had no idea that this small act, this simple knock on the door, would change everything. Not just for his daughter, not just for him, but for an entire community that believed wealth gave them the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with power, not with money, but with a child's innocent words, "May I?" The air inside the mansion changed the moment Jamal stepped across the threshold. It was as if the silence that had suffocated the hall cracked open, replaced by something warm and alive. He didn't pause to stare at the marble floors or the chandeliers glittering above him. He didn't hesitate at the sight of the grand staircase or the priceless artwork lining the walls. Instead, his attention went straight to Emma, sitting in her wheelchair near the table where the untouched cake waited like a monument to disappointment. "Wow," Jamal whispered, his eyes wide as he looked at the decorations. "This place looks like something out of a movie." He darted toward the table and gasped theatrically. "And that cake, it's bigger than my whole kitchen. Are you sure you don't need a crane to cut it?" Emma burst into laughter, the kind of laugh that bubbled up from deep inside her chest and shook her small shoulders. She covered her mouth, embarrassed by how hard she was giggling, but Jamal only grinned wider, clearly pleased he had made her forget herself. Robert stood at the edge of the room, watching with astonishment. In less than a minute, this boy had done what years of carefully orchestrated therapy sessions could not. He had made Emma feel normal, not a patient, not a fragile child who needed protecting, just a girl having fun. Jamal's imagination seemed endless. He looked at Emma's wheelchair, tilting his head as if considering it. Then he crouched low and said, "You know what this looks like to me? The fastest race car in the world. I bet you can go 0 to 60 faster than anyone." Emma's eyes widened. "A race car?" "Absolutely," Jamal said, stepping behind her and gently placing his hands on the handles. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Westfield Grand Prix." His voice boomed like an announcer at a stadium. "And in lane 1 we have the incredible, unstoppable, unbeatable Princess Emma." Emma squealed with delight as Jamal pushed her chair forward across the polished floors, making engine noises with his mouth. "Vroom, vroom," he shouted, swerving playfully around the empty chairs as if dodging obstacles on a racetrack. The clown, still slouched against the wall, with his phone, looked up in surprise. For the first time that afternoon, his painted smile didn't seem quite so hollow. He slipped his phone into his pocket and watched as the two children sped past, their laughter echoing through the massive hall. "Pit stop!" Jamal cried, bringing the wheelchair to a halt near the table. He leaned down as if whispering to the wheels. "How's the tire pressure? Do we need to change the oil?" Emma laughed so hard, she nearly tipped her cup of soda. Robert felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Relief. Relief that Emma could still laugh, still glow with joy. Relief that maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't doomed to be a string of disappointments and polite rejections. But underneath that relief was something else. Something heavier. A sharp pang of guilt. Because it wasn't him who had brought that joy back to her. It wasn't his money or his power. It was this boy from the housing projects with nothing but a patched t-shirt and a heart big enough to light up the room. As the children played, Robert moved quietly to the side, standing by the window. He watched them through the reflection on the glass, his thoughts tangled. How is it possible, he wondered, that this boy, this stranger, can see Emma for who she really is when the children who grew up with her turned their backs? His phone buzzed in his pocket. A name flashed on the screen, Patricia Vanderbilt. He hesitated, dread curling in his stomach. Patricia wasn't just another parent. She was the president of the school board, the kind of woman who wielded influence like a weapon. He answered reluctantly. "Robert," came Patricia's crisp voice, as cold and sharp as a knife. "We need to talk. I've heard there's someone at your house." Robert frowned. "What do you mean, someone?" "A boy," Patricia said flatly. "From the housing complex. My phone has been ringing nonstop. Parents are concerned." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. He glanced across the room, where Jamal was bowing dramatically as Emma clapped, her eyes shining brighter than the balloons above her. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't the forgotten child in the wheelchair. She was the center of joy. "Patricia," Robert said slowly, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "That boy has shown more kindness in the last 20 minutes than I've seen from this town in years." There was a pause on the line before Patricia spoke again, her tone sharp with disapproval. Robert, don't be naive. Those people don't belong in our circle. You need to think carefully about the example you're setting. Robert's blood boiled. He stared out at the garden, at the reflection of his daughter's smile in the window pane. Patricia, he said through gritted teeth, if you had half the class of that boy, you'd understand what it means to be human. He ended the call before she could reply, his hand shaking with fury. Behind him, Jamal shouted, "And the winner of the Grand Prix is Princess Emma." He raised her arm like a champion, and Emma beamed so brightly that the whole mansion seemed to glow with her. Robert turned back, his chest tight. Something told him this afternoon was not just a birthday party. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake Westfield to its core. Robert stared at his phone long after the call ended, the cold echo of Patricia's words hanging in the air like smoke. Those people don't belong in our circle. He repeated them silently, tasting the venom behind them. He had known Patricia for over a decade. Her polite smiles at charity events, her picture-perfect family portraits in glossy magazines, her sermons about values during school board meetings. And yet, beneath that polished exterior was the heart of a woman who believed kindness was a liability and compassion a stain on reputation. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tight. In the hall behind him, Emma's laughter still rang pure and unbroken as Jamal guided her wheelchair around the garden doors, announcing each lap of their imaginary race. For a moment, Robert allowed himself to watch them, holding on to the fragile beauty of it. But deep down, he knew Patricia's call was not the end. It was the beginning. Sure enough, the storm broke just hours later. That evening, as the last rays of sunset painted the mansion walls, Robert's phone rang again. It was Helen Carstairs, the headmistress of Emma's private school. Her voice was careful, clipped, every syllable chosen with precision. "Mr. Mitchell, I wanted to discuss a delicate concern." Robert sank into the leather chair in his study, his patience already frayed. "Go ahead." "We've received reports," Helen said, her tone as frosty as the marble floors in her office, that Emma has been associating with a boy from the public housing units. Some parents feel this may not reflect the values our school community strives to uphold. Robert closed his eyes. His temple throbbed. "So you're telling me that my daughter, who has spent 2 years being ignored and excluded, is finally laughing again, and you want me to discourage it because the boy comes from the wrong address?" Helen cleared her throat, unflustered. "Our institution has a reputation, Mr. Mitchell. Families expect a certain standard of social behavior. Perhaps it would be best to reconsider these new associations." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, Robert was speechless, rage pulsing through his veins. Then, before his temper boiled over, he ended the call with a curt, "Thank you, headmistress. We'll speak again soon." He dropped the phone onto his desk, his hand shaking. The silence of the study pressed in around him. He poured himself a glass of scotch, staring into the amber liquid as if it could explain the world's cruelty. The truth was clear. Patricia had already started making calls, pulling strings. The Vanderbilt name carried weight, and in a place like Westfield, reputation was currency. She was building an army, and her first target was not him, it was Emma. Next morning, the attacks came sharper. 3 of Robert's biggest pharmaceutical contracts suddenly evaporated. Clients who had been loyal for decades called with vague excuses, strategic shifts, new partnerships, unfortunate timing. But Robert knew the game. This was no coincidence. Patricia and her circle of power were tightening the screws. On Tuesday, his membership at the Westfield Golf and Country Club was quietly re-evaluated. The letter he received was polite, dripping with civility, but its meaning was vicious. "Perhaps you should realign your social priorities before renewal." By Wednesday, even the staff in his company had begun whispering. Board members avoided his gaze during meetings. Investors called with concerns. The message was clear. Westfield's elite were drawing a line, and Robert Mitchell, the man they once courted for his money and prestige, was now on the wrong side of it. But the cruelest blow came on Thursday. That afternoon, Emma returned, from school with her eyes swollen, her lips trembling. She rolled her chair into his study, her hands fumbling with the wheels. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The girls in my class said I can't sit with them at lunch anymore. They said—" She swallowed, her small hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. "They said if I keep being friends with Jamal, then I'm not one of them anymore." Robert dropped to his knees in front of her, his heart shattering at the sight of her pain. "They said I was—" She trailed off, refusing to say the ugly word. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "They said Jamal doesn't belong, and if I like him, then I don't belong either." For the first time in years, Robert felt something inside him snap. It wasn't just anger. It was fury. A deep, consuming fire that burned hotter than any boardroom betrayal or business sabotage he had ever faced. They weren't just targeting his reputation now. They were wounding his daughter. They were punishing her for daring to love a friend who cared about her when no one else would. Robert pulled Emma into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. "Listen to me, princess," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "You are worth more than all of them combined, and Jamal is the best friend you could ever have. Don't you ever let their poison make you doubt that." Emma nodded against his chest, though her tears continued to fall. Robert lifted his head, his jaw set like stone. The attacks had gone too far. Patricia Vanderbilt and her allies thought they could use fear, gossip, and prejudice to break him. But they had underestimated something far more dangerous than his wealth or power. They had awakened a father's wrath, and Robert Mitchell had resources Patricia couldn't even imagine. By Friday morning, the storm Patricia had unleashed was in full swing. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was open hostility wrapped in the thinnest layers of politeness. Robert arrived at his office to find a stack of urgent memos waiting, each one stamped with the same sterile language. Contract. Termination. Reevaluation of partnership. Strategic realignment. These were clients who had done business with him for decades, companies that owed their very existence to the breakthroughs his pharmaceutical empire had provided. Yet here they were, severing ties without hesitation. He sat at his desk, staring at the papers, his hand frozen on the last letter. He could almost hear Patricia's voice behind the words, smug and cruel. This wasn't business. It was sabotage, calculated, coordinated, and merciless. And it wasn't aimed at him alone. It was meant to crush Emma, to punish her for daring to find joy where they thought she shouldn't. Robert's phone buzzed. An email from the Westfield Philanthropy Circle, the city's most powerful charity board, landed in his inbox. It was an invitation withdrawal. They no longer wanted his presence at their upcoming gala. The words stung. "We feel your recent social choices may not align with the values of our organization." Social choices. He nearly laughed at the absurdity. Was kindness now a crime? Was letting an 8-year-old boy into a birthday party enough to exile his family from the world they had once been the crown jewel of? Later that day, Robert went to pick Emma up from school himself. He wanted to see for his own eyes what she had whispered to him in tears the night before. He parked the Bentley outside the wrought iron gates and watched as children streamed out, laughing in clusters, their designer backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. And then he saw her. Emma rolled her wheelchair slowly, her head lowered, her movements heavier than usual. Around her, girls she once called friends walked in tight circles, whispering and glancing at her with cruel smirks. One of them, Patricia's daughter, turned deliberately away as Emma approached, tugging the others with her, leaving Emma stranded in silence. Robert's hands tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He had seen cutthroat negotiations, ruthless boardroom betrayals, and billion-dollar power plays. But nothing compared to this. Nothing compared to the sight of his little girl being isolated, not for what she had done, but for who she dared to call a friend. When Emma finally spotted him, her eyes flickered with relief. But beneath it, he saw the deep bruise of rejection. She climbed into the car slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want me anymore, Daddy. They said Jamal makes me different." Robert forced a smile. but his throat ached as he answered, "Different isn't bad, sweetheart. Different is brave, and you are braver than all of them." That evening, he couldn't eat. He couldn't think. He paced the study, replaying every cruel word he had heard this week. The phone calls, the contracts, the stares. Patricia and her circle believed they had already won, that their influence was enough to bury him under shame and force Emma back into silence. But they had miscalculated. They thought Robert Mitchell was just a businessman protecting his empire. They didn't realize he was a father protecting his daughter. And a father with resources, intelligence, and fury was far more dangerous than a CEO with power. Still, a gnawing thought haunted him. He couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed to understand the boy who had somehow ignited all of this. He needed to know Jamal, not just as Emma's friend, but as the spark that had threatened the false order of Westfield. That night, Robert stood by Emma's bedside as she slept, her hand curled around the stuffed bear her late mother had given her. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered, "I promise you, princess, they will not break you. I won't let them." His reflection in the dark window stared back at him, a man transformed. By morning, his decision was made. He would go to the housing project, knock on the Rodriguez family's door, and find out who this boy really was. Because somewhere deep in his gut, Robert knew Jamal was more than just a child who wandered into a party. He was the beginning of something larger, something that would shatter Westfield's illusion of perfection. And Robert Mitchell was ready to light that fire. The morning air was sharp and cool as Robert steered his black Bentley away from the manicured lanes of Westfield toward a part of town he had never truly noticed before. The further he drove, the less the streets resembled the glossy perfection of his neighborhood. The lawns grew patchier, the roads rougher. Eventually, the skyline of glass and marble gave way to weathered brick buildings and narrow streets lined with faded cars. He slowed when he reached the housing complex Jamal had pointed to from the mansion gates, Westfield Gardens. To most of the city's elite, it was a name whispered like a warning, a place they dismissed with stereotypes: crime, poverty, broken families. But what Robert saw as he parked was not what the stories painted. He saw children, racing each other with laughter, women carrying groceries with toddlers tugging at their skirts, old men sitting on stoops sipping coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but there was life here. Real, unpolished, unpretentious life. He stepped out of the car feeling oddly out of place in his tailored suit. Eyes followed him as he crossed the lot, not with hostility, but with curiosity. He was clearly a stranger here, a man who carried privilege like a second skin. He found the apartment number Jamal had mentioned, 2B. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened slowly, and standing there was a woman in her 60s. Her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her face lined not with defeat, but with strength. Her eyes were dark and steady, and though her clothes were simple, her posture radiated dignity. "Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, her accent soft but clear. Robert nodded. "Yes, you must be Jamal's grandmother." "I am Carmen Rodriguez," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Please come." The apartment was small, just 3 rooms, but immaculate. The smell of warm bread lingered in the air. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the worn wooden table, their colors bright against the modest walls. Family photos lined the shelves. Jamal grinning with missing teeth, a younger woman holding him as a baby, Carmen standing proudly with her arm, around a man Robert assumed was her son. "Jamal told me about the party," Carmen said, folding her hands gently, "and about the problems it has caused for you." Her eyes searched his face, kind but direct. Perhaps it would be best if he did not visit Emma anymore. Robert shook his head firmly. "No, absolutely not. Your grandson brought my daughter back to life. I won't take that away from her." He paused, his voice softening. "I came here because I want to understand. How do you raise a boy like him in a world that judges so harshly?" Carmen smiled faintly, though her eyes carried decades of untold stories. "We came here from Mexico 30 years ago, Mr. Mitchell, with nothing but hope and faith. Life was not kind at first. People judged us by our accents, by our skin, by where we lived. But we taught Jamal something simple. Dignity does not come from money or approval. Dignity comes from knowing who you are. That is why when others turn their backs, he still opens his heart. As she spoke, the door behind them opened again. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform smeared with grease and paint. His hands were rough, his boots worn. But when he saw Robert, he straightened with quiet pride. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm Miguel, Jamal's father." Robert returned the handshake, surprised at the strength in the man's grip. Miguel's eyes, though tired, shone with honesty. "I want you to know," Miguel continued, "we are not looking for charity or favors. We work for what we have. Jamal knows that. He knows that kindness is not weakness. It is strength." Robert studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. "Miguel, I want to make you an offer. My company is expanding its social responsibility program. We need someone who understands the needs of this community, someone who knows what it means to work hard and never give up. I think you are that." "Man," Miguel's brow furrowed. "But I'm just a construction worker. I never went to college." Robert shook his head. "You have something more valuable than any diploma: integrity. I can teach business. I cannot teach what you already carry." For a moment, silence filled the room. Carmen's hand trembled slightly against the table, and Miguel's eyes dropped to the floor. When he looked up again, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "Why would you do this for us?" Robert's answer came with the weight of truth. "Because your grandson reminded me who I used to be, before money blinded me, before I forgot what really matters." But even as the words left his lips, Robert's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was James Thompson, his lawyer and oldest confidant. He answered quickly, turning slightly away. "Robert," James's voice was urgent. "You need to see what we've uncovered. Patricia and her circle. This isn't just social prejudice. It's bigger, much bigger." Robert's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "There's a scheme: systematic housing discrimination, illegal contracts. They're planning to force these families out of Westfield Gardens to build a luxury condominium. We have recordings, emails, everything." Robert's eyes swept the modest apartment, the photographs, the warmth of a family that had nothing, but gave everything. His jaw tightened. "They want to erase this place," James continued. "And they will, unless we stop them." Robert ended the call slowly, his mind blazing. He turned back to Miguel and Carmen, his voice calm but charged with fire. "Miguel," he said, "I'm not just offering you a job. I'm asking you to stand with me. Because this fight isn't about my reputation anymore. It's about protecting families like yours from people who think kindness is weakness and prejudice is power." Carmen's eyes glistened, and Miguel nodded slowly, his voice steady. "Then I will stand with you." Robert reached across the table, shaking his hand again, sealing something greater than a business deal. It was an alliance, a promise, a spark that would soon set fire to the empire of lies Patricia Vanderbilt had built. And in that small, humble apartment, Robert Mitchell knew the battle for Westfield had just begun. Robert drove back from Westfield Gardens with the weight of two worlds pressing on his chest. The leather of the Bentley's steering wheel creaked beneath his grip as he replayed James Thompson's words. Systematic housing discrimination, illegal contracts. They want to tear it all down. For years, Robert had thought he understood power. He'd believed it was measured in profit margins, market shares, and the deference of men who shook his hand in boardrooms. But sitting in that humble apartment, surrounded by peeling paint and photographs of a family that radiated dignity, he realized he had never really understood what power meant. Not until he saw how much these families stood to lose, and how ruthlessly people like Patricia Vanderbilt were willing to take it from them. By the time he reached his mansion, dusk had painted the sky with streaks of violet and gold. Emma was in the garden with Jamal, their laughter drifting through the open windows like music. He paused at the door, watching them as Jamal pushed her chair over the grass, both of them squealing as if they were conquering mountains. For a moment, Robert allowed himself to breathe, but then the phone in his pocket buzzed again, snapping him back to the battle he now knew he couldn't ignore. "James," he answered. His lawyer's voice was brisk, urgent. "We've compiled everything. Emails between Patricia and city officials, contracts with fraudulent valuations, even recordings of her discussing how to make life unbearable for the families until they cave." Robert's blood ran cold. "You're telling me she said that out loud? Word for word? And she wasn't alone. Charles Morrison, half the city council, at least 6 other prominent families, they're all knee-deep in this. It's a coordinated land grab." Robert's reflection glared back at him from the window pane. He saw his own face, jaw tight, eyes hard. He thought of Emma's tears when her classmates rejected her. He thought of Jamal's patched sneakers standing at the gates of his mansion. And then he thought of Patricia sipping champagne in her perfect dining room while plotting to evict families who had nothing. "How long have they been doing this?" Robert asked. "Years," James replied. "But this time we have them. Federal housing officials have been investigating quietly. What you've endured this week? It wasn't just social cruelty. It was a distraction, a test to see if they could break you before the council vote." Robert's voice was steel. Then they failed. That night, Robert sat alone in his study, documents spread across his desk. He read every email, every transcript, every clause in the falsified contracts. Each page was another nail in Patricia's coffin. By midnight, his decision was made. He wouldn't wait for whispers to ruin him. He would bring the truth into the light before the very council Patricia believed she controlled. The next day, he returned to the Rodriguez apartment. Miguel was already home, his hands still stained from work, but his posture tall, unshakable. Carmen sat at the table, folding laundry with quiet grace. Jamal was sprawled on the floor, sketching something with crayons. Robert placed a thick folder on the table. "This is everything," he said. "Proof that they're trying to erase your home. Proof of the lies, the bribes, the racism hidden behind their polished smiles." Miguel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. His jaw tightened as he read. Carmen's lips trembled, but she held her head high. Jamal looked up from his drawing, sensing the weight in the room. "They want us gone," Miguel muttered, his voice low. "They want more than that," Robert corrected. "They want to rewrite this city in their image, where only people who look like them, live like them, belong." He leaned forward, his voice charged with determination. "But they've underestimated us. They think I'm just one man, easy to isolate. What they don't know is that I'm not standing alone anymore." Carmen's eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd met her, Robert saw something flicker across her expression. Hope. "On Monday night," Robert continued, "the city council will vote to approve the demolition of Westfield Gardens. Patricia thinks she has the outcome guaranteed, but we're going to walk into that chamber with more than hope. We'll have evidence, journalists, federal officials, and when we show the truth, the whole city will see them for what they are." Miguel looked up, meeting Robert's gaze. His voice was steady, resolute. "Then we'll stand with you, not as charity, as partners. Because this isn't just about our homes, Mr. Mitchell. It's about proving that dignity cannot be bought or stolen." Robert reached across the table, shaking his hand. "Then let's make them regret ever underestimating us." That night, as he drove back home, Robert thought of Emma again. She had begged him once to explain why her friends had left her, why no one wanted to come to her party. He hadn't known what to say then, but now he realized the answer. It wasn't that Emma was broken. It was that the world around her was, and fixing it, piece by piece, family by family, was no longer a choice. It was his duty. And on Monday, in front of the entire city, he would make sure Patricia Vanderbilt learned that when you build power on prejudice and lies, you build it on sand. And sooner or later, the tide always comes. Monday evening came with a charged electricity in the air, the kind of tension that clings to skin and makes the heart race before a storm breaks. The council chamber of Westfield was packed to its rafters. Rows of polished wooden benches were filled with business leaders, socialites in pearls and suits, reporters with notebooks in hand, and families from the housing complex who had arrived early, clutching each other with nervous hope. Television cameras lined the back wall, red recording lights blinking like watchful eyes. At the front of the chamber, beneath the seal of the city, the council members shuffled papers with bored expressions, ready to rubber stamp what they believed would be an inevitable vote. Item 15 on the agenda: final approval for the Westfield Gardens redevelopment project. Patricia Vanderbilt sat in the front row, her Chanel blazer pressed, her hair sculpted to perfection. At her side, developer Charles Morrison whispered to her, a smug smile twitching at his lips. This was supposed to be their moment of triumph, the moment the working-class families of Westfield Gardens were erased with the stroke of a pen. Mayor Henderson cleared his throat, his voice droning over the microphone. Item 15, the Westfield Gardens project. Council is prepared to vote on approval of demolition and redevelopment. The heavy doors at the back of the chamber swung open with a groaning creak. Heads turned. Robert Mitchell walked in, not alone but flanked by Miguel Rodriguez, James Thompson carrying a thick folder, 3 investigative journalists, and a representative from the Federal Housing Department. Behind them, families from the housing complex filed in quietly, their presence a silent statement of everything this vote would decide. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Patricia's smile faltered just for a moment before she straightened her posture. Desperate theatrics, she told herself. It's too late. The vote is already secured. Robert moved to the center of the chamber, his voice calm but carrying through the silence. Before this council proceeds, he said, I believe the people of Westfield deserve to hear the truth about what this project really is. Council members shifted in their seats. Mayor Henderson tried to maintain composure. Mr. Mitchell, this is highly irregular. James Thompson stepped forward, his voice sharp. Highly irregular is conspiring to defraud families of their homes. Highly irregular is falsifying property values, manipulating municipal contracts, and violating the Federal Fair Housing Act. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Patricia's fingers clenched against her designer handbag. James activated a projector. The first audio clip filled the chamber, Patricia's own voice dripping with disdain. We need to make these people's lives so uncomfortable they'll have no choice but to accept our offer. Cut off services, increase fines, do whatever it takes. The sound echoed like a hammer striking stone. Patricia's face drained of color. The second slide flashed onto the screen. Emails exchanged between Morrison and city council members, outlining strategies to speed up evictions, referring to the residents as undesirables, who were lowering property value. A murmur of outrage swept through the audience. Families in the benches clutched each other tighter, some crying silently. Mr. Morrison, James said coolly, perhaps you'd like to explain why your company offered 30% of market value for these properties while secretly planning a luxury condominium project worth billions? Morrison shifted in his seat, his face flushing crimson. He tried to stand, but 2 federal agents at the back moved forward, blocking the exit. Cameras snapped, the sharp click of shutters filling the air like gunfire. Robert finally stepped forward, his voice steady but weighted with fire. For weeks, my family has been attacked. My daughter, a child, was humiliated and isolated because she dared to laugh with a friend who came from this very community. You thought you could break us with whispers and prejudice. But while you were plotting, I was watching, documenting. And what I found wasn't just cruelty, it was crime. He turned, his gaze locking on Patricia. You called my daughter's friend an inappropriate element, an 8-year-old boy with more grace and dignity than this entire room. Well, today the world will see the truth, and they will know the real inappropriate elements are sitting right here, hiding behind wealth and status. The final recording played. Patricia's voice again, brittle and cold. We need to clean up Westfield. These people don't belong. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Then the chamber erupted. Shouts, Gasps, journalists surging forward with cameras and microphones. Federal agents stepped in, handing out warrants, moving toward Patricia and Morrison. Patricia stood, her composure cracking. "This is outrageous. You can't do this. I am Westfield." "No," Miguel Rodriguez said, rising slowly, his voice calm but resonant. "You were Westfield, but Westfield belongs to all of us now." When the agents clasped cold steel around Patricia's wrists, the cameras flashed like lightning. The queen of Westfield's elite led out in handcuffs before the very people she had scorned, her name forever tied to disgrace. Robert stood tall, his daughter's face vivid in his mind, her tears, her laughter, her unbroken hope. Justice had begun. But as he watched Patricia disappear through the doors, he knew this was only the beginning. The real work, the rebuilding of trust, of community, of dignity, was still to come, and he was ready for it. The chamber buzzed like a hive. As Patricia Vanderbilt was escorted out in handcuffs, the metallic click of the cuffs echoing louder than any gavel. The cameras flashed relentlessly, every angle capturing the image of a woman who had once ruled Westfield's social order, now stumbling under the weight of her own disgrace. Charles Morrison tried to shrink into his chair, but the federal agents had no mercy. They were on him next, pulling him to his feet as he muttered protests that no one in the room believed. The sight of these untouchables brought low electrified the chamber. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. For Robert, it was a moment of vindication, but not triumph. He didn't feel the thrill of revenge that some men might have sought. What filled him instead was a profound, almost sobering sense of justice. Patricia and Morrison were not just losing face, they were being exposed for who they had always been. And for Robert, that mattered far more than any contract or social club. He turned his gaze toward the rows of families from Westfield Gardens. They were standing now, tears in their eyes, whispering to each other in disbelief. Carmen Rodriguez clutched her rosary, her lips moving in a quiet prayer of thanks. Beside her, Miguel straightened, his broad shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of invisibility. He wasn't just another construction worker in that moment. He was the voice of every family who had been silenced. Mayor Henderson, his face pale with sweat, tried to regain control of the room. "Order, please. This meeting is—" But he was drowned out by Miguel, who rose and addressed the council with a voice that carried more authority than the mayor's gavel ever could. "My family came to this country 30 years ago with nothing but hope. We worked every day, paid every bill, followed every law. We didn't ask for charity or handouts. We asked only for the right to live in peace, and yet for people like Patricia Vanderbilt, that was too much." The chamber fell into a hush. Miguel's voice trembled with emotion, but it never wavered. "You tried to destroy us because we reminded you of what you've forgotten. That human value is not measured by money or skin color, or the neighborhood you come from. It is measured by dignity, and dignity can't be bought. It can't be stolen. It lives here." He pressed a hand to his chest. "In all of us." Applause broke out. Not polite claps, but thunderous, sustained applause that shook the chamber walls. The families from Westfield Gardens stood and cheered. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens capturing every word. Even some council members, their faces ashamed, bowed their heads in silent agreement. Robert felt a lump in his throat. He turned slightly, and there she was, Emma, sitting with Jamal at her side. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed, her small hands gripping the arms of her chair as if holding on to the moment. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the forgotten girl in the wheelchair. She was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Jamal leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She giggled softly, her eyes bright with the kind of light Robert hadn't seen since before the accident. It was in that moment that he understood. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or saving homes. It was about giving children like Emma and Jamal a world where friendship wasn't a battlefield and kindness wasn't a crime. As the agents led the last of Patricia's allies out, Robert stepped forward one final time. His voice was steady, but each word struck like a hammer. You thought you could silence us with prejudice. You thought you could buy justice with contracts and influence. But today proves what I have always believed. Truth does not need wealth to win. It only needs courage. And in this city, courage has a new name. He looked at Emma, at Jamal, at Miguel and Carmen. Courage looks like this. The chamber erupted again, applause cascading through the room like a wave. For the first time, in years, Robert didn't feel like the CEO of a pharmaceutical empire or a man struggling with guilt. He felt like a father who had finally kept a promise to protect his daughter, not just with money, but with truth. As the council meeting adjourned in chaos, reporters rushed toward him, microphones thrust in his face. "Mr. Mitchell, what happens next? Will you press charges? What will this mean for Westfield?" Robert simply placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, guiding her chair toward the exit. "What happens next?" he said quietly, just loud, enough for the cameras to catch, "is rebuilding, not just buildings, hearts, trust, a city that belongs to everyone." And as the doors closed behind them, Robert knew the battle was won, but the war for Westfield's soul was only beginning. 6. Months later, Westfield looked like a city waking from a long sleep. The scandal that had rocked its core had left scars, yes, but from those wounds something unexpected had begun to grow. On Main Street, where once the high-end boutiques had stood as symbols of exclusion, a new community center now thrived. Children poured in and out of its glass doors, clutching books, basketballs, and art supplies. The building had been funded by Mitchell Pharmaceuticals, but its heartbeat came from the people, teachers, volunteers, and parents who had never before been invited to sit at the table. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Miguel stood with a hard hat tucked under his arm, beaming with pride. He had overseen the entire project, no longer a construction worker on someone else's site, but the director of social responsibility for Robert's company. Emma and Jamal were there too, standing side by side, their friendship now something of legend in Westfield. Reporters no longer asked them awkward questions. Instead, they leaned forward eagerly, recording every word when the two children spoke at schools about kindness, inclusion, and what it meant to be a true friend. Emma's wheelchair was no longer a reason for pity, but a symbol of resilience. And Jamal, once dismissed as unsuitable, was now the boy who had reminded an entire city of its humanity. At home, Robert had noticed the change most of all in his daughter. The shadows that once dimmed her spirit had lifted. She laughed, more easily now, not just with Jamal, but with a circle of new friends who accepted her exactly as she was. Her mornings weren't filled with dread before school, but with excitement about what she and Jamal would discover next. One afternoon, Emma rushed into Robert's study, a tablet clutched in her hands. "Daddy, look!" she exclaimed. On the screen was a photo of Jamal holding a blue ribbon, his grin wide, his eyes sparkling. He won first place at the science fair. His project on community medicine is going to the state finals. Robert set down his pen, his chest swelling with pride, not just for Jamal, but for the boy's determination to dream beyond the limits others had tried to set. "That's incredible," he said softly. "Tell him I said congratulations." Emma beamed. "He wants me to help with his next project. We're going to do it together." Moments like these were priceless to Robert. He realized now that his fortune, his influence, his carefully curated empire, none of it compared to the sight of his daughter glowing with confidence again. The ripple of change had spread even further. At the private school, the board had been reshaped. Headmistress Helen Carstairs had been dismissed in disgrace, replaced by Dr. James Patterson, a black educator whose entire career was built on creating inclusive classrooms. Scholarships were expanded and children from all backgrounds began filling the once homogeneous halls. For the first time, the school felt alive, messy, diverse, vibrant. At the community clinics Miguel now oversaw, parents lined up with their children, no longer fearful of whether they could afford treatment. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals had adopted a bold new policy. For every high-margin drug sold to patients with premium insurance, another was given free to families who couldn't afford it. Critics said it would cut profits. Instead, profits soared, because integrity had become the company's brand. But while Westfield blossomed, Patricia Vanderbilt's world collapsed into rubble. Her mansion had been sold off to cover legal fees. She lived now in a modest apartment, stripped of the empire she had once wielded like a weapon. Her name was synonymous with disgrace, studied in business schools as a warning about the cost of arrogance. Her children no longer visited, unable to bear the shadow of her downfall. And though Robert had no desire for her suffering, he knew it was justice. She had learned too late that cruelty always collects its debt. On a warm Saturday morning, Robert sat in his garden watching Emma and Jamal put the finishing touches on a presentation board about diversity. Jamal leaned over, whispering something that made Emma burst into laughter, and Robert found himself smiling too. "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "Do you remember when no one came to my birthday party?" Robert's chest tightened. "Of course I do. I thought it was the worst day of my life," she said, her eyes shining as she looked at Jamal. "But now I think it was the best, because if those kids had come, I wouldn't have met him, and we wouldn't be here." Jamal nodded seriously, his tone carrying the weight of his grandmother's teachings. "My grandma always says when people show you who they are, believe them. Those kids showed who they were, and your dad showed who he was too. That's why we're standing here today." Robert's throat burned. He realized then that this entire journey, the humiliation, the betrayal, the collapse of old alliances, had been worth it. Because it had revealed what money could never buy: truth, dignity, friendship. And as he watched his daughter and the boy who had knocked on his door that lonely afternoon, Robert knew the real legacy of his life wasn't his company or his fortune. It was this: a city reborn through the courage of children, and the lesson that the smallest acts of kindness can change the world. The mansion was quiet that afternoon, the kind of golden silence that comes after a storm has passed. The garden outside was alive with laughter. Emma and Jamal were huddled together over their project boards, debating what colors to use for their charts. Robert stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on them with a softness that no boardroom ever saw. It was a year to the day since Emma's birthday party, the party that no one had come to, the day that had cut him deeper than any corporate betrayal. And yet, looking at his daughter now, radiant with joy, he realized it had been the day that saved them all. His phone buzzed on the desk. He almost ignored it, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. But the name flashing on the screen made him pause. Patricia Vanderbilt. For a long beat, he simply stared at it. Patricia, the woman who had tried to isolate his daughter, humiliate his family, and erase entire neighborhoods for profit. The woman who had been led away in handcuffs, as cameras captured every second of her downfall. Against his better judgment, he answered, "Mr. Mitchell." Her voice was thin, brittle, nothing like the sharp, commanding tone she once wielded. I know I have no right to call, but I wanted to say something." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. His instinct was to hang up, to cut her off the way she had tried to cut his family from the world. But something in her voice, fragile, almost pleading, stilled him. "Go on," he said. "I wanted to apologize," Patricia whispered. "Not just to you, but to Emma, to Jamal, to the Rodriguez family, to every single person I wronged. I lost everything, Mr. Mitchell, my home, my wealth, my reputation. Even my children won't speak to me anymore. And for the first time, I see myself clearly. I see the monster I became." Her voice cracked, trembling with something Robert had never heard from her before. Genuine remorse. "I thought money made me powerful. I thought control made me strong. But your daughter, and that boy, they showed me something I should have learned a long time ago. That true wealth has nothing to do with money, and true power comes from kindness." Robert closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He thought of Emma crying in her wheelchair, whispering, "Did they forget about me?" He thought of Jamal, patched sneakers and missing tooth, knocking on the door with nothing to offer but his presence. He thought of Patricia, smug and cruel, whispering that Emma's friend was unsuitable. And now here she was, stripped bare, broken, reaching for the humanity she had once mocked. "Patricia," Robert said at last, his voice quiet but steady, "your apology doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the families you tried to destroy, and only they can decide if they forgive you." "I know," she said quickly. "I've written to them. To Miguel, to Carmen, even to Jamal. I don't expect their forgiveness, but I needed them to know that I finally understand." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside the window, Emma's laughter rang again, bright, unshakable. Robert's heart swelled with pride. "Patricia," he said finally, "you're right about one thing. True wealth has nothing to do with money, but it took losing everything for you to see it." Her voice broke into a sob. "Yes, it did." Robert hung up gently, setting the phone on the desk. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel vengeance. What he felt was something deeper, quieter, closure. He stepped out into the garden, where Emma waved him over excitedly. "Daddy, Jamal says, our project might go to the regional fair, can you believe it?" Robert smiled, kneeling beside them. "I can believe it. Because when two people with hearts like yours work together, there's nothing you can't change." Emma leaned into him, her small hand curling around his. Jamal grinned, his eyes sparkling with the same unshakable light that had carried him to their door 1 year ago. And Robert realized then that the true revenge against prejudice was not destruction. It was this: a life rebuilt on kindness, a community reborn through courage, and a future where his daughter was no longer invisible but radiant. The day no one came to Emma's party had become the day that reshaped a city. And all it had taken was a knock on the door and a boy's simple question, "May I?"